Hi, this is David Maddox, political editor of The Independent, joined by my excellent colleague, Millie Cooke, our political correspondent. Here we are in the luxurious independent office in Parliament, replete with all our books and things. And this is the first of a regular series of Brexit videos as we mark 10 years, in fact, today, this very day.
Oh, happy anniversary to Brexit.
10 years of the Brexit anniversary, and tomorrow 10 years of David Cameron leaving. So every cloud has a silver lining, as they say. But so we thought we'd reflect back a bit on 10 years ago and where we were and what we were doing. And of course, you were 18.
It was.
Yeah.
I mean,
Tell us about it.
I was quite a politically active 18-year-old. So I voted for the first time and felt really strongly about remaining in the EU. Voted for the first time, and it was also the day that I think I did my last A-level. So we went out and I voted, I went home from school, voted, and then I went to a club when I was 18. And then I remember so clearly being in the taxi on the way home from the nightclub. I'd had a few drinks and the taxi driver had the radio on and it was playing, I think it must have been the exit polls or just sort of like reporting on the fact that it looked like we were leaving. And I just remember being awake at some like silly early hour in the morning and thinking, oh no, like it's really happening. And I was so shocked. And then the next day I was in like a sort of state of despair because I was 18, quite hungover, and realised there was no chance I was going to be going to Europe in the next few years if I was doing a year abroad or working there. And I felt really sad. I think I remember at the time it was the first political issue that I'd got really involved with and that I really sort of understood and felt strongly about. And it was my first vote. And I just remember feeling this real sense of sort of political sadness at the time.
Of course, I was, and confession time.
It's all coming out today.
I was at the Daily Express, which was campaigning for leave. That was the original newspaper to campaign for leave, and I was one of the guests at the champagne reception of Aaron Banks and with Nigel Farage and things. And I was there for Nigel Farage's New Dawn speech about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I remember being hugged by always jubilant Brexiteers who were imagining lots of extra money for the NHS, trade deals, Britain suddenly becoming a superpower on the world stage again. I think all sorts of weird and wonderful dreams, none of which have come to pass. But it did, when we were talking about this beforehand, I did actually think back to the much longer distant past when I was 18 as well. And I remember when I was 18, I was off interrailing around Europe. People welcomed Brits. Then it was, Europe was still expanding. The European Union was still expanding. The Cold War had finished, just not long finished, and Eastern European countries were asking to join at that point. I mean, I remember being in places like Prague and Bratislava and Budapest. These were still fledgling democracies after the communist dictatorship, they were desperate to join the EU. And of course now they're there and we're out. And it feels a real change. And part of me kind of looks back on that and think of the opportunities I had and my generation had, and actually how Millie's generation and others kind of missed out as a result of what happened.
There's a real feeling among, especially a lot of my friends, at this sort of stage in our lives where a lot of my friends don't have a mortgage or a long-term relationship, and it would be the ideal time to go and live and work abroad. And a lot of them, when they were younger or their older siblings, went and moved to Europe for a few years. And I think there's this real feeling now that that's something they missed out on, and trying to get a visa to go to Europe, it's much harder. It's a very different ballgame. You can't just pick up, leave, move somewhere and then try and find a job once you get there. And there is a real sense of sadness about what we sort of missed out on. And I think that among younger people especially, I think there's also a kind of an ideological longing for it as well, because I think people, especially as the world gets more turbulent, I think there's that feeling of togetherness that I think that people miss. And I remember so clearly after when I went interrailing when I was 18, there was a lot of like anti-British sentiment in the EU when we were traveling around Europe. It was right after the referendum result. And again, I think a lot of that comes from this feeling that Brexit was an isolationist choice. And I think that I think there are lots of young people who think that it's a shame.
Yeah. I mean, my wife is Italian. I'll never forget coming back from Aaron Banks's party. I got a taxi from Millbank Tower in Westminster all the way back to Dagenham, which suppose you'd leave, should say East London voted leave on the whole. My wife had been unable to sleep and was utterly distraught. Is still distraught, really, by it all. It was, the impact it had on people like her and other Europeans who had made their lives here and made a real contribution to this country. It's still been felt to this day. Let's turn now to the events of this week. As I say, in Westminster. Obviously now we're seeing the end of Keir Starmer. And I wonder if we're also seeing a change in the conversation about Brexit, because one of the things I think, and one of his many problems, was he'd fought to stop us leaving, but then become very timid on the issue. The whole reset had grand aims of taking us back to the heart of Europe, but it didn't really. It was all tinkering. And he had his red lines: no rejoining the EU, no customs union, no single market. We're now almost certainly getting Andy Burnham, who has said he wants to rejoin. There's talk Wes Streeting, who just recently made a speech about rejoining and the need to rejoin, may get the Chancellor role. I wonder, it won't happen immediately, it may take an election or two, but I wonder now if that experience of the last 10 years is pushing us back, and as your generation and young voters come through will want that experience, want a more pro-European, that actually that path will be eased.
Yeah, it does feel a lot to me like the idea of rejoining is much less of a dirty word than it used to be. I think that for the first few years after Brexit, which I do think is right, is that the British people voted for something and you kind of then need to give it a good go. But I think that now it's been 10 years, I think the tide is turning a bit on that, and it feels less of a difficult subject, less of a taboo to say, actually, look, we've done it for sort of 5 years now, we've actually been out. We might need to rethink this. And I think that now that it's been given a good go and it doesn't seem to be working that well, feels less of a kind of a hot potato issue. And especially given people like Wes Streeting are openly talking about going back into the EU, that really changes the window of what's acceptable discourse. But then it's interesting because you've also got the same voices like Nigel Farage on the other side of the debate who are saying a very similar thing to what they used to be saying, which is we need to have a hard Brexit, we need to go even further. So it feels like actually 10 years on, the debate, we haven't got any closer together. All the questions that were being asked haven't been answered yet. A lot of the problems haven't been solved. And we're in a very similar position politically as we were 10 years ago, except this time we're out and looking in.
Well, you have a very interesting story, I think, on the colleague that we've had on Brexit. And the top line of it, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting stuff in it, but the top line of it is that people think things like immigration, which was so central to that debate, the issue has got worse, not better, as a result of Brexit. And actually you can see some of the mechanics of that, the fact that it's harder to return illegal or irregular migrants to Europe now that we're no longer part of the European Union. It's harder to actually regulate the borders, it turns out, even without free movers.
Yeah, and also there were just huge numbers of visas given out in the years after Brexit, so it just ballooned and ballooned and ballooned, and we actually never really solved the immigration problem that people really wanted to solve when we were debating Brexit. And yeah, this polling is really interesting. It effectively said that it was almost 2/3 of people were saying that they think it's got worse. It was only 8% that said they think it's got better since Brexit. And there were other things as well about whether or not you'd vote for a party that pledged to rejoin. I think 40% of people said that they would vote for a party that pledged to rejoin. Interestingly, if you look at the party breakdown on that, there's still massive divides. So Reform voters obviously wouldn't back a party, so they rejoin. Labour voters, overwhelmingly would. There are still real splits there. I think overall there seems to be a lot of discontent about the way that Brexit's been handled, but there are still question marks over what the solution is, whether it's closer alignment, not just tinkering around the edges, but serious closer alignment with the EU, or whether it's a full rejoin, or, as Nigel Farage wants, a sort of hard Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the question in the end will be how amenable is the European Union and how willing are they to take us back? Because if they want us back, they would be sensible to offer the terms essentially we had before, maybe with a much stiffer and clearer exit penalty in case, which would be fair, I think. Whereas if they try to kind of punish Britain further and be seen to do that, then say, well, you have to join the euro, well, you have to pay, there's no discount on how much you pay and things like that. Then I think that then focuses minds to vote against again, and it becomes a different question, because I suspect people's desire to rejoin, whilst genuine, is not a blank check.
Yeah.
And so an awful lot depends on the European Union itself. But I think if they were to make an offer, come back on terms, but with a stronger penalty clause, then people would take that. But anyway, we're going to be doing this regularly as we mark the 10th anniversary, and there will be many 10th anniversaries to come, as some of you will remember, on various issues and debates and votes and crises which happened in the years immediately after Brexit. One thing, though, I would say is that this week has just shown us again how politically unstable the country has been left by Brexit. It's no coincidence that we're now looking at our 7th Prime Minister since that referendum.
Yeah, 100%. It feels like they can stay up anymore.